In a town wrapped in sunlight and routine, danger felt like something that belonged somewhere else, far beyond the quiet streets of South Lake Tahoe, California. It was the kind of morning that would never make the news, the kind people forget by lunchtime, but sometimes tragedy doesn't announce itself. It walks quietly into the light. On June 10, 1991, 11-year-old Jaycee Lee Dugard left her home just after sunrise. Her pink jacket caught the mountain breeze, her backpack bouncing with every step. She was shy, gentle, and curious, the kind of child who stopped to pet stray cats and drew hearts in the margins of her notebooks. From the porch, her stepfather, Carl Probin, watched her disappear down the hill, her hair glowing gold in the early light. He remembered she turned once, smiled, before rounding the bend toward the bus stop. A simple, ordinary moment that would never happen again. Then came the sound, a low hum on the gravel road. The squeal of tires, a door slamming, too hard, too sudden. A single scream pierced the calm, and just like that, silence reclaimed the street. Within seconds, Carl was running barefoot down the driveway, his heartbeat pounding louder than the echo of that scream. But by the time he reached the road, it was too late. The only thing left was a cloud of dust, and the fading outline of a gray sedan vanishing into the pines. In less than a minute, Jaycee Dugard was gone. What followed would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American history, a case that stretched across decades, shattered a mother's faith, and exposed the dark truth about how evil can hide in plain sight. For 18 years, the world would know Jaycee's name only through posters and prayers, until one ordinary morning, she would walk into a police station and speak the words no one thought they would ever hear again. "My name is Jaycee Lee Dugard." At 7:56 a.m., the quiet neighborhood on Washington Boulevard changed forever. What began as a peaceful morning dissolved into chaos, the kind that doesn't arrive with warning, only aftermath. Carl Probin's voice echoed down the road, hoarse and desperate. "Jaycee, Jaycee!" But the trees swallowed his cries. He saw the spot where she had been only seconds before, the loose gravel, a dropped hair tie glinting in the dirt. He didn't need to see more. His gut already knew the truth no parent ever wants to face. His stepdaughter hadn't simply wandered off. She'd been taken. Carl sprinted back to the house, lungs burning, heart racing. His hands shook as he dialed 911. His voice cracked so badly the dispatcher had to ask him twice for the address. "My stepdaughter, she's gone. A car took her. Gray sedan, maybe a Ford. Please hurry." By the time the first patrol car arrived, Carl stood barefoot in the gravel, trembling. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the mountain calm. The street filled with uniformed officers, radios crackling, voices tense but controlled. Neighbors emerged in slippers and confusion, clutching coffee mugs, faces drained of color. They whispered her name as though afraid it might already belong to the past. Within minutes, Washington Boulevard became a crime scene. Officers scoured the road shoulder, measuring tire impressions in the dirt, marking footprints with chalk. A sheriff's deputy crouched to examine disturbed gravel, while another walked slowly with eyes fixed on the tree line. Every sound, a snapping twig, the distant drone of a car, felt like a lead. Jaycee's mother, Terry Probin, was at work when the call came. The voice on the other end said only one word that mattered: missing. She left before the call ended. The world blurred past her windshield, trees, traffic, sunlight, none of it real. When she reached the house, yellow police tape stretched across the yard like a wound. Terry ducked under it, ignoring shouts from officers. Her eyes locked on Carl, pacing in the driveway, his face pale and hollow. "She's gone," he said. "I tried. I couldn't." The words broke apart in his throat. Terry didn't hear the rest. Her knees gave way, her body folding as if gravity itself had turned cruel. Around her, radios hissed, sirens screamed, voices overlapped, all merging into one long, unbearable roar. By midday, the story was already on every local radio station. An 11-year-old girl abducted near her South Lake Tahoe home. A phrase repeated so often, it began to sound unreal. Helicopters swept over the forest, blades cutting through the summer air. Search teams formed grids, moving shoulder to shoulder through creeks, meadows and ravines. Volunteers brought flashlights, water bottles, sandwiches, small offerings to fight back the helplessness. The command post was set up at the local fire station. Inside, tables disappeared under maps of the region, each red pin marking a possible clue. Officers studied tire tracks, strangers' cars, parolee lists. None of it led anywhere. Outside, the sun dropped behind the ridgeline. A single streetlight flickered near the corner where Jaycee had last been seen. Its pale circle of light stretched across the empty road, a cruel reminder of how fast a life could vanish. As darkness fell, her name carried through the trees, whispered by searchers, called by neighbors, murmured in prayer. The forest answered with silence. For the first time, South Lake Tahoe, a town that had always felt safe, felt foreign, suspicious, broken. Inside the Probyn home, time stopped moving. The clock hands circled, but meaning was gone. Carl sat in the living room, replaying the moment again and again. The car, the dust, the scream, wondering what might have changed if he'd run faster, shouted sooner, noticed more. Terry stayed by the phone, unwilling to leave, convinced that if she did, the call they prayed for would finally come, and she wouldn't be there to answer. By nightfall, the television flashed Jaycee's school photo for the first time. Blonde hair, shy smile, the face of a child the world would soon know but never really see again. That night, under a canopy of cold stars, hundreds of strangers searched for a girl they had never met, and the town of South Lake Tahoe learned what it meant to live with a ghost. The first 24 hours after a child disappears are the longest hours of a parent's life. Every second stretches, every sound becomes a possibility, every silence feels like a threat. By dawn, South Lake Tahoe was awake, but the air felt wrong. The scent of pine and summer had turned to exhaust and adrenaline. Helicopters cut slow circles above the tree line, their spotlights brushing over rooftops and dirt roads. Beneath them, deputies and volunteers moved in lines through the forest, calling a name that no longer sounded like a name: Jaycee. At the local fire station, the command post buzzed like a beehive. Folding tables disappeared beneath maps and coffee cups. The maps were marked with colored pins, red for sightings, blue for tire marks, yellow for places already searched. Radios crackled with updates that came and went like static. Sheriff's deputies, state troopers, even the FBI joined the effort. Every parolee in the county was checked. Every gray sedan within 50 miles was stopped. But the truth was brutal. There was no clear trail, no ransom, no demand. Just a girl who had been swallowed by daylight. Outside, volunteers gathered, their faces pale with exhaustion but unwilling to go home. Parents, hikers, retirees, people who had only learned her name that morning, now shouted it into the trees as if willpower alone could bring her back. Some carried flashlights. Others carried hope like a fragile flame cupped in their hands. As the hours bled into days, television vans began to appear along Washone Boulevard. Satellite dishes unfolded like metal flowers. Cameras pointed at the police tape. Reporters spoke in solemn tones, calling it the abduction that stunned Tahoe. For the residents, it wasn't a headline. It was a nightmare being filmed. Inside the Probyn home, the air smelled of coffee, paper, and grief. Detectives asked the same questions in different ways. Was there anyone suspicious in the area? Had Jaycee mentioned a stranger? Had anyone seen the car before? Terry could only shake her head, eyes red, voice trembling. She doesn't even like walking alone, she said. She's just a little girl. Carl sat in silence. The guilt pressed on him like a weight he couldn't lift. He replayed every frame of that morning in his mind. The smile, the scream, the cloud of dust. He tried to remember the license plate, but panic had erased it. When an officer told him, "You did what you could," it didn't help. Guilt doesn't respond to logic. The search expanded beyond Tahoe, highways, gas stations, rest stops. Jaycee's school photo appeared on posters, milk cartons, and bulletin boards across Northern California. Pink flyers with her face were stapled to telephone poles, grocery store doors, and church walls. Each one a plea, a prayer, a fragment of a missing world. At night, the community gathered for candlelight vigils. Hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the tall pines, candles flickering in the cold mountain air. A priest said her name aloud. A mother whispered it under her breath. The light trembled but did not die. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The search radius widened until it reached the Nevada border. Helicopters still flew, but fewer now. Reporters still came, but their questions changed from "when will she be found?" to "will she ever be found?" The world outside began to move on, but inside one small house time refused to. Jaycee's bedroom stayed untouched, her bed made, her notebooks stacked neatly on the desk, her favorite pink jacket still hanging on the hook by the door. Every morning Terry dusted the room as if preparing it for her daughter's return. On the dresser sat a hairbrush, still holding strands of golden hair. She couldn't bring herself to clean it. Carl returned to work eventually, but his mind stayed on that road. The sound of tires, the shape of a car vanishing into the bend. People called him brave for chasing it. He called himself too slow. As autumn settled over the mountains, the bright pink flyers began to fade under the rain and sun, their edges curling like dead leaves. The town that had once been defined by beauty and calm became defined by what it had lost: a child, a sense of safety, a belief that some places were beyond evil's reach. In the months that followed, the case went cold. The search parties disbanded. The news trucks drove away. The neighbors stopped leaving their porch lights on. But inside that small house, one mother refused to stop believing every morning. Before dawn, Terry Probyn stood by the window, watching the horizon glow with first light. And every morning she whispered the same words: "Please let today be the day." Time has a strange way of softening memory, not erasing it, but dulling the edges until even pain begins to sound like background noise. For Terry Probyn, time did not move forward. It only circled the same moment: a car door slamming, a scream, and silence. In the months following Jaycee's disappearance, life became a ritual of waiting. The phone was never left unanswered. The porch light was never turned off. The calendar hung open on June 1991 and was never flipped again. Each morning, Terry sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the phone. Every ring sent a jolt through her chest. Every silence left her hollow. Detectives came and went. Leads surfaced, then dissolved. Someone thought they saw a girl like Jaycee in Sacramento. False. Another caller claimed she'd been spotted near a highway rest stop. Another dead end. The FBI's tip line overflowed, but none of it led home. Even the most promising clues unraveled under scrutiny. Psychics called offering visions. Reporters called asking for comment. Hope became a full-time job and exhaustion its shadow. Outside, South Lake Tahoe tried to return to normal. Tourists came, boats filled the lake. Children played in the same streets, but for one family, the world had stopped. Inside the house, Jaycee's room stayed frozen in time. Her stuffed animals gathered dust. Her schoolbooks sat open on the desk, and a poster of a kitten hung slightly crooked on the wall. The air smelled faintly of lavender and paper, the scent of a life interrupted. Carl rarely spoke about that day anymore. When he did, his voice carried the same rawness, as if no time had passed at all. He blamed himself for not being faster, for not memorizing the license plate, for letting the sound of an engine slip through his fingers. Neighbors, once constant visitors, began to visit less. Not out of cruelty, but because grief that lasts too long makes people uncomfortable. They offered casseroles, condolences, then distance. The media cycle moved on. Other stories took its place. New headlines, new victims, new tragedies. The world forgot, as it always does. But for Terry, forgetting was impossible. Forgetting would mean acceptance, and acceptance meant death. By the second year, even the detectives' visits slowed. Files thickened, dust gathered, and Jaycee's case number became just another entry in the system. An unsolved mystery in a country full of them. The pink flyers weathered to white. The ink bled under rain. They peeled off poles and fluttered down gutters. Fragments of a vanished childhood carried away by wind. And still, every morning, Terry stood by the window, whispering the same prayer. Please let today be the day. 200 kilometers away, another world existed. In Antioch, California, the air was dry, the streets long and unremarkable. Rows of beige houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their lawns brittle under the summer sun. It was the kind of neighborhood where people nodded politely and minded their own business. Privacy was a virtue. Questions were rare. At the end of one cracked driveway stood a modest single-story house with faded shutters and a leaning mailbox. To passers-by it looked ordinary, but behind the tall wooden fence that enclosed the backyard, higher than most, patched with mismatched boards, the ordinary ended. Behind that fence was another reality. The yard was overgrown with weeds and littered with tarps, sheds, and makeshift tents. The air smelled of dust, mildew, and something else, time itself, stale and unmoving. It was here that Jaycee Lee Dugard lived, unseen, unheard, forgotten by the world. The man who had taken her, Philip Garrido, was a name that meant nothing to the neighbors. To them he was just another eccentric, a man who sometimes strummed his guitar on the porch and talked about religion in circles that led nowhere. His wife Nancy walked their dog each morning, eyes down, smile tight. Together, they were the kind of strange that people preferred to ignore. Sometimes at night, faint laughter drifted over the fence. Small, quick, almost childlike. Neighbors paused for a moment, listening, wondering, then explained it away. Probably visiting relatives, they said. Maybe a daycare. And the world kept moving. No one imagined that behind that fence, a stolen life was still unfolding. Years slipped by, disguised as routine. New neighbors came and went, never asking why the fence never aged, why the backyard lights flickered at odd hours, or why the same old tarps hung through every season. In Antioch, privacy wasn't suspicious. It was sacred. While the world forgot, Jaycee learned to adapt. She learned silence. She learned to live small, to move quietly. The days blurred together. Sunlight through torn fabric, rain drumming on plastic, the hum of a radio somewhere far away. Sometimes she whispered to herself, to the sky visible through a tear in the tarp. The only piece of the world that never left her. It's still there, she told herself. The sky hasn't gone anywhere. 18 years would pass before that sky, her only witness, would finally open wide enough for the world to see her again. Behind the fence, time was not measured in hours or days. It was measured in sounds. The bark of a neighbor's dog, the drone of a passing airplane, the distant hum of a world still spinning without her. For Jaycee Lee Dugard, those sounds became proof that life still existed, just not for her. When she first arrived in that backyard, she didn't understand what was happening. The fence looked impossibly tall. The spaces between the boards were narrow, enough to see slivers of sky, but not enough to see freedom. The ground smelled of dirt and plastic. Tarps hung overhead like artificial clouds, blue and brittle from the California sun. In those early weeks, she tried to remember what freedom had felt like. The cool air of Tahoe mornings, her mother's voice calling her in for breakfast, the sound of her school bus brakes squealing at the corner. But memory is fragile. In captivity, it begins to fade, replaced by survival. The man who took her, Philip Garrido, called the place the backyard, but it was more like a maze, part prison, part world. There were sheds converted into rooms, old tents stitched together, paths of trampled dirt winding between them. When it rained, the water pooled in corners. When it was hot, the tarps turned the air into something you could almost chew. In this confined world, Jaycee learned silence. She learned to move without making noise, to speak softly, to obey when it meant staying alive. She learned the rhythm of her captor's moods, the calm, the delusion, the storms. And in the spaces between those moods, she found tiny cracks where her spirit could still breathe. At night, she talked to stray cats that slipped through the gaps in the fence. She gave them names. She told them secrets she could tell no one else. When she found smooth stones in the dirt, she collected them, arranging them in circles, her way of marking time. Sometimes she drew on scraps of paper, sketches of mountains, trees, the sky she remembered. Each drawing was a quiet rebellion. In a place where every part of her life was controlled, imagination was the one thing that belonged entirely to her. Days became months. Months became years. The seasons came and went in whispers, the air shifting, the light changing, but nothing else. Outside the fence, the world moved on. New presidents, new phones, new lives. Inside, Jaycee lived in a loop, the same paths, the same sounds, the same sky. She tried to keep count of the days at first, scratching small marks into the wooden frame of a shed. But eventually the lines blurred together, too many to read, too painful to continue. She stopped counting. Instead, she made up stories in her head, about a girl who lived behind a fence but could still see the stars, who learned the language of silence, who one day would walk through the gate and never look back. She didn't know that story was her own. As the years passed, Jaycee grew from a child into a teenager. Her captor's control deepened, twisting into delusion. He told her she was chosen, that God spoke to him, that the fence was protection, not imprisonment. His words tangled religion with madness until truth itself lost meaning. When Nancy Garrido, his wife, entered Jaycee's world, things didn't get better, only quieter. Nancy brought food, clothes, false kindness. She smiled when she needed to, scolded when told to, and pretended everything was normal. Jaycee learned quickly that pretending was part of survival. Years later, Jaycee would describe it not as living, but as enduring. "I stopped fighting because fighting made it worse," she wrote. "But I never stopped hoping. Hope came in strange forms. Sometimes it was the sound of children playing beyond the fence, their laughter floating through the air like ghosts of a life she once had. Sometimes it was the smell of rain reminding her of home. Sometimes it was the small, clear patch of blue sky visible through a tear in the top. She would stare at that patch for hours. "It's still there," she whispered. "The sky hasn't gone anywhere." That patch became her compass, her prayer, her proof that the world outside the fence was still real. Years blurred into each other until Jaycee's body told her something her mind could barely process. She was pregnant. In captivity, time doesn't follow normal rules. There are no calendars, no clocks, no witnesses, only moments that arrive without warning. She gave birth alone, guided only by fear and instinct, and then she was no longer just surviving for herself. Motherhood gave her purpose inside a place that was meant to erase her. She taught her daughters how to read from old magazines, how to draw animals they'd never seen, how to name stars they couldn't see. Her voice became their world, soft, steady, strong. Even in captivity, Jaycee created life. Years continued to pass. The world beyond the fence evolved. New neighbors moved in, new police patrols drove by, but no one ever looked closely enough. The Garridos smiled, waved, played the part of an eccentric couple who liked their privacy, and the world accepted it. In Antioch, indifference became the perfect disguise. Sometimes officers even visited the house, routine parole checks. They never asked to see the backyard. Each time they left, Jaycee watched the patrol car fade from view through a crack in the fence. So close she could almost whisper for help, but didn't. Fear had long ago learned to silence hope, and yet, deep within her, a voice refused to die. "Someone will see," she told herself. "Someone will notice." It took 18 years for that to come true. 18 years of silence. 18 years of waiting for the sound that had started it all. The sound of an engine. A door opening to mean freedom again. In the summer of 2009, that sound would finally return. And this time it wouldn't bring a nightmare. It would bring the end of one. After 18 years of silence, the first sound that would lead Jaycee back to freedom wasn't a siren or a shout. It was the soft echo of footsteps on a college campus. On August 24, 2009, a man named Philip Garrido arrived at the University of California, Berkeley. He walked with the same uneven gait he always had, talking faster than his thoughts, his words a jumble of God, sound waves, and salvation. Beside him stood two girls, one about 15, the other perhaps 11. They were neatly dressed, their hair combed, their posture unnaturally still. To most people, it was a scene strange enough to ignore, but not to Officer Allison Jacobs. Jacobs had worked campus security for years. She'd seen her share of eccentric visitors, but something about this trio pulled her attention. The man's wild confidence, the girl's silence, the way their eyes followed him instead of the world around them. She invited Garrido into her office. He spoke for nearly half an hour about his project called God's Desire. He claimed he could control sound, communicate with divine energy, change the world through his ideas. The girls said nothing. Their smiles were polite, mechanical, rehearsed. Jacobs watched them carefully. "What are your names?" she asked softly. The older girl hesitated, eyes flicking to Garrido before whispering an answer. The younger one didn't speak at all. It wasn't just fear. It was obedience, a silence learned, not chosen. Jacobs felt the air shift. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. After Garrido left, she sat for a long time, her pulse still racing. She opened her computer, typed his name into a database and waited. Philip Garrido, registered sex offender, parolee, convicted of kidnapping and assault. Her stomach dropped. The man she'd just met was not a preacher or a visionary. He was a predator. Jacobs picked up the phone and called his parole officer in Contra Costa County. Her voice was steady, but her words carried urgency. "There's something off," she said. He had 2 young girls with him. They didn't speak. They looked trained. The parole officer sounded surprised. Garrido's record showed nothing unusual. His check-ins had been routine, but Jacob's tone left no room for doubt. Within hours, parole agents scheduled a mandatory meeting. Garrido was ordered to appear the next morning and to bring anyone living in his household. The next day, August 26, 2009, at precisely 9 a.m., the front door of the parole office opened. Philip Garrido walked in, smiling too widely, his hands fluttering with nervous energy. Behind him were the 2 girls from Berkeley, quiet, obedient, and a woman trailing several steps behind. She was thin, pale, her posture small. Her eyes never met anyone else's. Parole officer Edward Santos watched them enter and immediately felt something tighten in his chest. He'd seen parole violators before. He'd seen liars, addicts, manipulators. But this felt different. As Garrido rambled about his new mission from God, his words tangled into nonsense. The girls stood frozen beside him, hands clasped, faces empty. The woman said nothing. Santos excused himself, stepped out of the room, and whispered to a colleague, "Call back up. Now." 2 more officers entered, pretending to continue a casual check. They asked Garrido questions, probing gently about his family, his home, his projects. Then one officer turned to the woman, his tone quiet but firm. "Ma'am," he said, "can you tell us your name?" The room went still. The woman's lips trembled. She glanced toward Garrido, then at the floor. For a moment, no one breathed. Then, in a whisper that carried more power than any scream, she said, "My name is Jaycee Lee Dugard." The silence that followed was absolute. Time seemed to hold its breath. The name hung in the air like a ghost resurrected. Santos blinked, trying to process what he'd heard. The name was familiar, burned into memory from old flyers, old bulletins, old headlines. But it couldn't be. "That was 18 years ago. Can you repeat that?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I'm Jaycee. I was taken a long time ago." The officers exchanged looks of disbelief, then of quiet horror. Phones were lifted, calls made, code spoken. Within minutes, the room filled with movement. Investigators, agents, voices overlapping. The impossible had become real. At the Antioch property, law enforcement arrived quietly, sealing off the street. Behind the wooden fence, they found a world that defied imagination. Tents, sheds, tarps, toys, books, beds. A hidden compound where life had continued, unseen, for nearly 2 decades. Jaycee's daughters, 15 and 11, had lived their entire lives inside those fences. No school, no doctors, no outside world. Just the echo of their mother's voice teaching them how to read, how to dream, how to survive. Officers described the scene as both heartbreaking and miraculous, a testament to human endurance and a condemnation of systemic failure. For years, parole officers had visited that very home, standing just meters from the truth, and never saw it. By evening, the news began to spread. First through radio whispers, then breaking alerts, then television screens. Across America, anchors struggled to contain their disbelief. Missing girl found alive after 18 years. Old detectives who had once searched for her sat in silence, tears in their eyes. Neighbors who had long ago given up whispered her name again, this time in awe. In a quiet government office near Sacramento, Terry Probyn waited, trembling. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In dreams, in prayers, in every sleepless night. But when the door finally opened and her daughter stepped through, reality felt almost too fragile to touch. Jaycee hesitated, older, thinner, eyes wiser than her years. For a moment neither spoke, then one word shattered 18 years of silence: "Mom." They fell into each other's arms, crying, laughing, shaking, as if time itself was catching up all at once. Around them, agents and officers turned away, giving them privacy they could never truly restore. Outside, the world called it a miracle. Inside that small room, it was simply the end of silence. For the first time since 1991, Jaycee Lee Dugard was free. The world woke to headlines that didn't seem real. Jaycee Lee Dugard, found alive after 18 years. It was the kind of sentence that made people reread it twice, then a third time just to believe it. Outside the Contra Costa Sheriff's Department, journalists crowded behind barricades, their microphones trembling in the wind. Inside, agents worked through the night, piecing together fragments of a story that spanned almost 2 decades. Every photograph, every object from that backyard was catalogued, proof of a life that had existed in plain sight, yet invisible to everyone. At dawn, officers escorted Philip and Nancy Garrido out in handcuffs. Philip grinned at the cameras, muttering about God's plan, about a story the world would soon understand. There was nothing to understand. 18 years of stolen life needed no explanation, only justice. Nancy stared at the ground, her silence heavier than his words. Reporters shouted questions. None were answered. Behind them, the beige house with its mismatched fence became a crime scene, its backyard sealed beneath tents of white plastic. Inside those makeshift shelters, investigators found traces of birthdays marked in crayon, hand-drawn posters, children's toys faded by sun and time. It was both devastating and sacred, evidence of survival. At a secure location near Sacramento, Jaycee reunited with her family. For a long time there were no words, just the sound of 2 people breathing the same air again. Her mother, Terry, touched her daughter's face as if afraid she might vanish again if she blinked. Carl stood a few steps behind, tears streaking down a face carved by guilt and years of waiting. When Jaycee smiled, hesitant, shy but real, it was as if the world exhaled. The next days blurred into interviews. Medical exams, therapy sessions, and paperwork. She spoke softly, carefully, as though the outside world might shatter if she raised her voice too high. She asked about her old cat, about the mountains, about her school. She remembered everything. Officials announced the arrest publicly, their voices solemn. The list of charges was long: kidnapping, false imprisonment, sexual assault, conspiracy. Both Garridos pleaded guilty in 2011. Philip was sentenced to 431 years to life. Nancy, 36 years to life. For once, justice felt solid, not symbolic. But for Jaycee, freedom was not immediate. 18 years had built invisible walls, routines of fear, rules of silence. Now the world was loud, bright, fast. Cell phones, the internet, digital cameras, even the language had changed. She often paused before answering, searching for words that no longer fit the time she'd lost. Still, each day brought something new. The feel of grass beneath bare feet, the smell of rain without tarps overhead, the joy of choosing her own breakfast. Freedom, she discovered, was not noise or celebration. It was quiet. It was walking outside without asking permission, The public called it a miracle, but Jaycee refused that word. Miracles happen by magic. She survived by will. In the months that followed, she chose silence over spectacle. She turned down most interviews, preferring to heal in private. For the first time since she was 11, her life belonged entirely to her. Her story, though, could not stay contained. When she eventually wrote A Stolen Life, it wasn't an exposé or a cry for vengeance. It was testimony. Every page, written in her own voice, transformed pain into power. Readers across the world wept, not just for what she lost, but for the grace with which she reclaimed it. Soon after, she founded the Jaycee Foundation, dedicated to helping families heal from abduction and trauma. Its mission was simple: to rebuild lives with compassion. Jaycee met survivors quietly, often sitting beside them in silence before speaking. She understood that healing begins in the spaces words can't reach. "I'm not what happened to me," she told an audience once. "I'm what I choose to become after." Her calm, steady courage reshaped how people spoke about survival. She became not a symbol of tragedy, but of endurance, living proof that even after years of darkness, light can return gently, without fanfare. Outside her home, the world kept spinning. Laws changed, parole systems tightened, awareness grew, and in a quiet garden somewhere in California, Jaycee planted flowers, each bloom a declaration that life, once stolen, can still be tended back into color, because some wounds never truly heal. But some people never truly break. Freedom, it turned out, wasn't loud. It wasn't the applause of news anchors or the flash of cameras. It was the sound of leaves moving in the wind, the small, forgotten music of life returning. For Jaycee Lee Dugard, recovery was not a single moment of triumph, but 1,000 quiet choices. To open a window without fear, to step outside without asking permission, to sleep through the night without listening for footsteps. The first weeks were a blur of hospitals, therapy, and interviews. She learned how much the world had changed. Cell phones, the internet, voices coming from small glowing screens. She had stepped out of 1991 and into a future she could barely recognize. At times, the noise of modern life felt overwhelming. Freedom could be frightening too. Her mother, Terry, stayed close, learning when to hold her and when to let silence do the healing. They spoke in fragments, stories of the past stitched carefully between long pauses. Sometimes they just sat together on the porch, watching the sun fade behind the hills, saying nothing at all. After 18 years of captivity, words had to relearn their purpose. In the beginning, Jaycee avoided interviews, reporters, even well-meaning strangers who called her a miracle. She didn't want to be a headline again. She wanted to be a person, so she turned inward, writing. At first, the pages were fragments, memories, smells, colors, feelings too big for sentences. Slowly, they became chapters. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to reclaim the narrative that had been stolen from her. Each paragraph was an act of ownership. When her memoir, A Stolen Life, was published in 2011, the world finally heard her voice, steady, thoughtful, free of bitterness. Readers expected anger. What they found was grace. Her words carried the same quiet strength that had kept her alive all those years. The book climbed bestseller lists, but success was never her goal. What mattered was connection. Letters poured in from survivors of trauma, parents of missing children, people who had lived through silence of their own. Jaycee read everyone she could. For each story, she felt the same truth echo. Pain shared becomes lighter. In 2012, she founded the Jaycee Foundation, named after the initials of her family. Its mission was simple: to support families affected by abduction and trauma, and to rebuild lives with compassion. The foundation offered counseling, educational support, and community programs for victims who often felt forgotten once the headlines faded. Jaycee met with survivors personally whenever she could. She rarely gave speeches from a stage. Instead, she sat in circles, listened, and spoke softly. Sometimes she didn't speak at all. She understood that silence, when respected, could be a form of kindness. Her calm demeanor often surprised people. She never described herself as a victim. "I'm not what happened to me," she said once, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm what I choose to become after. That sentence became the Foundation's heartbeat. Years passed. Jaycee began to live the small, ordinary moments she had dreamed about through the fence. Morning walks with her dog, planting a garden, cooking breakfast while sunlight poured through the kitchen window. Ordinary things, yet each one sacred. Sometimes she still looked up at the sky, the same patch of blue that had kept her alive all those years. But now it was boundless. Freedom, she realized, was not about forgetting what happened. It was about refusing to let it define the rest of her life. In the quiet of her garden, she often spoke to schools and advocacy groups through video messages. Her tone was calm, her words deliberate. She urged empathy, not just for survivors, but for vigilance in communities, for noticing what hides behind fences, both real and metaphorical. Through her work, laws changed. Parole systems strengthened. Neighbors paid closer attention. Jaycee never demanded credit. Her existence was her statement. 18 years had been stolen from her, but every day since had been claimed back by choice. She learned that healing isn't about erasing scars. It's about learning to live beautifully with them. Her story became part of something larger, a reminder that evil can hide in ordinary places, but so can grace. In interviews, when asked how she kept her humanity, she smiled gently and said, "I looked at the sky every day. It reminded me that the world was still there, waiting." From a backyard of shadows, a woman stepped into the light, not to relive her pain, but to teach the world how to listen, how to see, how to hope. Because survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning. Some wounds never truly heal, but some people never truly break.